The smoke came first, a gray veil moving inland from the Pacific on the morning of January 7, 2025, as sirens echoed along Bavamantine 985 Pacific Coast Highway in Pacific Palisades. Below the ridge, the Getty Villa, completed in 1974 as a full-scale evocation of the Roman Villa dei Papiri, sat in its narrow canyon, colonnades reflected in the long rectangular pool of the peristyle garden. Inside, gallery lights glowed against cool plaster and stone while the grounds burned, more than 1,000 trees scorched, a perimeter wall destroyed, irrigation pipes melted, the villa sealed behind double walls and fire doors designed decades earlier in consultation with architects Robert E. Langdon Jr. and Ernest C. Wilson Jr., their drawings now boxed in the Getty Research Institute's construction files. From the shaded loggia, the marble basin at the pool's edge still caught the sky, a perfect frame of ordered water above a blackened slope. It had been conceived as a sanctuary for antiquities and for a man who believed art could outlast bloodlines. Today, under a reddened sun, even this fortress of culture looked temporary, a Roman dream waiting its turn to become only smoke, stone, and photographs. In the late autumn of 1936, on 641 South Irving Boulevard, just off Wilshire in Los Angeles, J. Paul Getty signed the papers for a Mediterranean revival mansion that locals already called the Phantom House. The building had stood empty for a decade, its shuttered windows and overgrown gardens lending it an air of Gothic abandonment unusual for sun-drenched California. Getty, then 43 years old and already controlling a network of oil interests that would soon make him one of the richest men in America, saw something in this derelict palace that others had missed, or perhaps feared. The transaction was completed quietly, without the fanfare that would later attend his acquisitions, and the deed transferred a property whose history already carried shadows that no amount of California sunshine could entirely dispel. The house had been commissioned in 1922 by William O. Jenkins, a controversial American businessman whose fortune derived from Mexican sugar plantations and textile mills. Jenkins had accumulated wealth in the chaos of revolutionary Mexico, navigating political upheavals and labor disputes with a ruthlessness that made him both feared and fabulously rich. When he decided to establish himself among the Los Angeles elite, he hired architect T. Beverly Keim Jr. to design a residence that would announce his arrival with unmistakable grandeur. Construction began that year on a steel and concrete structure that would eventually encompass 14 bedrooms, multiple reception halls, formal gardens terraced down toward the street, and amenities that exceeded what most American families could imagine. The cost reached $250,000, a sum that in Depression-era values represented the equivalent of several million in later currency, enough to build a small hotel or fund a modest college. Keim designed the mansion in the Spanish colonial revival style, then fashionable among California's wealthy, drawing on the missions and haciendas that gave the state its romantic mythology. But he infused his creation with an unusual grandeur that exceeded typical residential scale. The facade featured ornate ironwork balconies imported from Spain, their scrollwork casting intricate shadows on stucco walls painted in warm Mediterranean tones. A red tile roof cascaded in multiple levels, creating a silhouette that dominated the Irving Boulevard streetscape. The two-story loggia that framed the entrance opened onto views across the Wilshire district toward mountains that seemed impossibly close in the clear pre-smog air of 1920s Los Angeles. Inside, the grand staircase swept upward beneath painted ceilings where artisans had worked for months applying decorative schemes inspired by Spanish colonial churches. The main salon opened through French doors onto a courtyard where a swimming pool, still a luxury item in the 1920s when most Americans considered indoor plumbing an achievement, reflected the California sky. Servants' quarters occupied a separate wing, connected by covered passages that allowed staff to move through the house without disturbing the family's activities. The kitchen, equipped with the latest appliances and staffed by a small army of cooks and scullery workers, could produce meals for hundreds of guests at the elaborate entertainments Jenkins planned to host. But Jenkins never truly inhabited his creation. Business complications in Mexico required his continued presence there. Legal troubles mounted as former associates and aggrieved workers pursued claims against his enterprises, and personal difficulties, the details of which remain obscure in the historical record, kept him from settling into the Los Angeles life he had imagined. By the mid-1920s, the mansion stood largely empty, maintained by a skeleton staff who dusted furniture in rooms that never welcomed guests and tended gardens that no family enjoyed. The property's towering presence on Irving Boulevard, with windows perpetually dark and gardens slowly returning to wilderness, earned it the nickname that would follow it through decades, the Phantom House. Passers-by whispered about ghosts, about curses, about the strange fate that seemed to attach to anyone who attempted to claim it. The whispers had no particular foundation, no documented deaths, no verified hauntings, no specific incidents that would justify supernatural explanation, but they persisted nonetheless, fed by the house's obvious emptiness and the mystery of why such a magnificent property should stand abandoned. Real estate agents who attempted to show the house reported that prospective buyers found the atmosphere oppressive, the rooms too large and too silent, the gardens too overgrown and too shadowed. Year after year, the Phantom House waited for an owner willing to accept whatever burden it seemed to carry. When Getty acquired the property in 1936, he was already developing the patterns that would define his later years. His 5 marriages had produced 5 sons: George Franklin, Jean Ronald, Eugene Paul, Gordon Peter, and Timothy. But his attention remained fixed on the accumulation of wealth and the objects that wealth could purchase. Personal relationships seemed to exhaust him in ways that business negotiations did not. He could spend hours analyzing oil leases, evaluating drilling prospects, and calculating the financial implications of decisions that would affect thousands of workers and millions of dollars. But he could not sustain the ordinary attentions that family life required. His wives came and went, each marriage following a similar trajectory from initial attraction through gradual estrangement to legal dissolution, the details varying but the pattern repeating with almost mechanical regularity. The Phantom House offered something that appealed to his particular psychology, a grand stage on which he need not actually perform. One of his ex-wives, according to accounts that vary in their specifics, lived in the mansion as a kind of architectural proxy, while Getty himself conducted business from hotels, offices, and rented apartments across multiple continents. The arrangement suited his preferences perfectly. He could claim ownership of a magnificent property, could list it among his assets, and mention it in conversations about his California holdings, without bearing the emotional weight of actually inhabiting it. The house served as a symbol rather than a home, a backdrop for a life that unfolded elsewhere. The house during these years served primarily as a set piece that announced Getty's position in Los Angeles society without requiring his continuous presence. Servants maintained the gardens, pruning hedges, and replacing seasonal plantings according to schedules established years before. The pool sparkled under the California sun, its water filtered and chemically balanced to perfection, even though weeks might pass without anyone swimming in it. The rooms stood ready for parties that Getty himself rarely attended, their furniture dusted and their carpets vacuumed by staff who had learned not to expect their employer's arrival. His preferred mode of existence was already becoming clear. He would build or acquire grand spaces, fill them with carefully chosen objects, and then observe them from a distance, as if life itself were a museum exhibition he had funded but did not wish to enter. The Phantom House's architecture embodied contradictions that would characterize Getty's relationship to buildings throughout his life. The mansion was designed for display. Its grand staircase existed to be descended in evening dress, its ballroom existed to host dancing, its dining room existed for elaborate meals served to appreciative guests. But Getty had no interest in display for its own sake. He cared about value, about investment, about the accumulation of assets that would compound over time. A house that stood empty accumulated nothing except maintenance costs and property taxes. Yet, he kept the Phantom House for more than 2 decades, neither selling it nor inhabiting it, maintaining it in a state of suspended animation that seemed to mirror his own emotional relationship to the places he owned. By the late 1940s, the Phantom House had attracted the attention of another kind of collector, the Hollywood studios. Location scouts from Paramount Pictures recognized that the mansion's combination of faded grandeur and unsettling emptiness made it perfect for stories about wealth gone wrong. The Spanish colonial architecture suggested old money, establishment, the kind of fortunes that predated Hollywood itself. The overgrown gardens and slightly neglected interiors suggested decline, the entropy that attends all human achievement. And the property's reputation as a haunted or cursed place added an atmospheric element that no set designer could have manufactured. In 1950, director Billy Wilder used the house as the exterior for Norma Desmond's decaying palace in Sunset Boulevard, the film that would define Hollywood's relationship to its own past. Gloria Swanson, herself a former silent film star whose career had faded with the coming of sound, played the delusional actress who believes she is still adored by millions. The mansion on Irving Boulevard became the architectural embodiment of her delusion, a grand house maintained in perpetual readiness for a comeback that would never arrive, its rooms filled with photographs of a younger self, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of a woman who refused to acknowledge that her time had passed. Swanson descended the Phantom House's grand staircase in her final deranged declaration that she was ready for her close-up, and the building became forever associated with the tragedy of obsolete magnificence. The film's famous closing shot, with Swanson moving toward the cameras as if toward her adoring public, while actually moving toward the police who will take her away, used the staircase to devastating effect. Each step downward marked another moment of delusion, another degree of separation from reality, another inch toward the abyss that awaits those who confuse image with substance. The architecture participated in the performance, its grandiosity making Swanson's madness more poignant by contrast. 5 years later, the mansion appeared again in Rebel Without a Cause, James Dean's iconic exploration of post-war youth alienation. The abandoned swimming pool where the climactic knife fight takes place was actually the Getty-owned pool on Irving Boulevard, drained and littered with debris for the filming. Dean's character, Jim Stark, navigating the empty basin that had once held water for wealthy swimmers, became an adat, emblem of a generation that inherited magnificent structures but found them hollow, useless, unable to provide the meaning that their construction had promised. The pool scene captured something essential about the American relationship to inherited spaces and the expectations they carry. Here was a facility built for pleasure, for the celebration of California living at its most luxurious, now converted into an arena for violence and death. The empty basin, with its cracked concrete and accumulated trash, spoke to a generation's sense that the promises made by their parents' prosperity had somehow failed to materialize. Dean fighting for his life in that drained pool was every American teenager struggling with the gap between what the culture promised and what it actually delivered. Getty himself seems to have been indifferent to these cinematic uses of his property. He collected the rental fees, presumably, and may have appreciated the publicity that attached to a building he owned, but there is no evidence that he took particular interest in how Hollywood used the Phantom House to explore themes of wealth, decline, and delusion. His concerns lay elsewhere, in the oil fields that produced his fortune, in the art market where he was becoming an increasingly significant buyer, and in the English property that would soon become his primary residence. The Phantom House had served its purpose as a symbol of his California success. Its transformation into a symbol of Hollywood's anxieties was merely incidental. But Getty himself was already looking elsewhere. By the mid-1950s, his attention had shifted decisively to European acquisitions, to the art collections that would eventually fill museums, and to the English estate that would become his principal residence for the rest of his life. The Phantom House, which had served its purpose as a marker of his California arrival, no longer interested him. The property represented a phase of his life that had passed, the years of establishing himself, of building his American reputation, of competing with other oil magnates for social position. Now he wanted something different: historical legitimacy, European culture, the patina of age that new money could purchase but not create. In 1957, he authorized the demolition of the Phantom House. Wrecking crews arrived on Irving Boulevard and reduced T. Beverly Keim Jr.'s Mediterranean Revival vision to rubble, clearing the ground for a Tidewater Oil Company office building that would rise in its place. The decision was purely practical from Getty's perspective. The property was worth more as commercial real estate than as a residential curiosity, and the office building would serve the expanding needs of his petroleum enterprises. That the mansion had acquired cultural significance through its film appearances, that it represented a distinctive example of 1920s residential architecture, that its destruction would erase a unique Los Angeles landmark. None of these considerations weighed against the financial logic of redevelopment. Local preservationists, a small and largely powerless group in the development-hungry Los Angeles of that era, protested without effect. The Windsor Square neighborhood, which had grown up around mansions like the Phantom House, watched as yet another piece of its architectural heritage disappeared beneath the wrecking ball. Letters to newspapers lamented the loss. Historical societies recorded what information they could. But Getty, who would later become famous for his dedication to preserving ancient artifacts in museum conditions, showed no interest in preserving a building merely because it was beautiful, historically significant, or culturally meaningful. Buildings, like all assets, existed to serve purposes, and when their purposes were exhausted, they could be disposed of without sentiment. The office tower that replaced the Phantom House still stands today on Irving Boulevard, its polished marble lobby occupied by workers who have no knowledge of what preceded it. No historical marker identifies the site as the place where a haunted mansion once gathered legends, where Gloria Swanson descended into madness, where James Dean fought for his soul in an empty swimming pool. The architectural memory has been erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed, the site absorbed into the commercial grid of modern Los Angeles, where nothing is permanent except the principle of profitable redevelopment. Yet, in the photographs preserved in studio archives and real estate records, the Phantom House remains visible, its balconies catching the light, its loggia framing views that no longer exist, its gardens spreading toward streets that have been widened and reconfigured beyond recognition. These images capture a moment in Getty's trajectory when he still believed that California was the stage for his ambitions, before he discovered that true permanence, the kind that outlasts bloodlines and business cycles, required older stones and more established traditions. The mansion that first linked Getty to cinematic immortality would itself be razed before the dynasty's tragedies had even begun, leaving only celluloid ghosts to mark where it had stood. On Wilshire, the first Getty Palace vanished before the dynasty's tragedies had even begun. By 1959, 23 miles from London, a 16th-century Tudor prodigy house called Sutton Place, near Woking in Surrey, became the principal residence of a man the press simply called the richest American. J. Paul Getty, then 66 years old and controlling an oil empire that spanned continents, had decided that his future lay not in the sun-bleached developments of California, but in the ancient landscapes of England, where history itself could be purchased and made to serve new purposes. The acquisition marked a fundamental shift in Getty's self-presentation, from American entrepreneur to transatlantic collector, from builder of new fortunes to custodian of old traditions. Sutton Place had been built around 1525 for Sir Richard Weston, a courtier to Henry VIII, who had traveled to Italy and returned with ideas about architecture that were revolutionary for Tudor England. Weston had served on diplomatic missions to France and the Italian states, where he had seen palaces that made English manor houses look provincial and cramped. He determined to build something that would bring Renaissance sophistication to the English countryside, a house that would demonstrate his continental education and his ambition to transcend the limitations of his island culture. The result was one of the earliest examples of Italianate Renaissance architecture in England. Classical proportions, symmetrical facades, and decorative terracotta work that must have seemed almost alien in a landscape still dominated by medieval Gothic traditions. The house that Weston created embodied the transition from medieval to Renaissance England. Its great hall, rising to a hammer-beam ceiling of extraordinary craftsmanship, recalled the communal spaces of earlier centuries, where lords dined with their retainers and hospitality served as the foundation of political power. But its long gallery, stretching 140 feet along the garden front, anticipated the more private, more refined lifestyle that the Renaissance would bring. A space for conversation, for the display of art, for the cultivation of aesthetic sensibility rather than military prowess. The house stood at a historical pivot point, looking backward to feudal traditions and forward to the age of individual achievement and cultural display. The estate changed hands multiple times over the following centuries, passing through families that rose and fell with England's political fortunes. Each generation left its mark, adding wings, modifying gardens, updating interiors to reflect changing tastes. But the essential structure that Weston had built remained intact. The Tudor brickwork, laid in intricate patterns that demonstrated the skill of 16th-century craftsmen, continued to glow in afternoon light. The Great Hall continued to receive visitors beneath its medieval ceiling. The long gallery continued to stretch toward gardens that generations of owners had modified but never entirely transformed. By the 20th century, Sutton Place had come into the possession of the Duke of Sutherland, but the costs of maintaining such a property in the modern era, the taxes, the staffing, the endless repairs to Tudor brickwork and leaded windows, had become prohibitive. The great English estates that had seemed permanent fixtures of the landscape were being sold, subdivided, or converted to institutional uses, as aristocratic families discovered that inherited prestige could not cover inherited expenses. The Duke faced the choice that confronted his entire class: sell the family heritage or watch it crumble through inability to maintain it. When Getty's agents approached with an offer of roughly £840,000, the Duke accepted. The sale included the main house, more than 170 acres of parkland, and the accumulated weight of 4 centuries of English history. Getty acquired not just a building, but a lineage, the right to occupy spaces where Tudor courtiers had intrigued, where Elizabethan poets might have visited, where generation after generation of English history had unfolded. For a man who had spent his life accumulating wealth, the acquisition represented something that mere money usually cannot purchase: historical legitimacy, the sense of participating in a tradition that predates and will outlast any individual fortune. Getty arrived at Sutton Place with the methodical attention to detail that characterized all his acquisitions. He ordered surveys of the building's condition, inventories of its contents, and assessments of the work required to adapt a Tudor manor to mid-20th century life. Teams of specialists evaluated the roof tiles, the window frames, the heating systems, the plumbing infrastructure that earlier owners had installed with varying degrees of success. The Great Hall, with its minstrel's gallery and hammer-beam ceiling, would serve for formal entertaining, though Getty's version of formal entertaining differed markedly from Tudor hospitality. The long gallery, stretching 140 feet along the garden front, would become his library, housing the books and manuscripts he collected with the same systematic energy he brought to acquiring oil leases. The bedrooms, 14 principal chambers and 20 servants' rooms, would accommodate the steady stream of guests, employees, and petitioners who sought access to the richest man in America. Getty organized these accommodations with characteristic precision, assigning rooms according to a hierarchy that reflected each visitor's importance to his business interests. Important executives received the best Tudor chambers, with views over the gardens and proximity to the master's own quarters. Lesser figures found themselves in the servants' wing, comfortable enough but clearly marked as peripheral to the household's central concerns. But Getty's improvements also reflected his famous parsimony, the reluctance to spend money that seemed to contradict his willingness to acquire expensive properties and priceless artworks. The installation of central heating proceeded slowly, leaving guests to shiver in bedrooms where Tudor fireplaces provided inadequate warmth against English winters. Visitors recalled waking to frost on interior window panes, their breath visible in air that felt more appropriate to the 16th century than the 20th. The kitchens, located at the traditional distance from the dining rooms, meant that food arrived cold after traversing stone-flagged corridors, a problem that modern Country houses had long since solved, but that Getty seemed unwilling to address. And most notoriously, Getty installed a pay telephone in a side corridor, requiring guests and staff alike to deposit coins if they wished to make calls. The gesture became legendary, reported in newspapers and magazines around the world, repeated in every profile and biography, cited endlessly as evidence of Getty's psychological peculiarities. Here was the richest man in America, occupying a Tudor palace with 170 acres of parkland, forcing his guests to fumble for coins when they wished to telephone home. The incongruity was so extreme that it seemed to demand explanation, some insight into Getty's character that would make sense of behavior that otherwise appeared simply bizarre. Getty himself offered various explanations over the years. He claimed that the payphone was installed to control telephone costs that had been spiraling out of control as guests made international calls without regard for expense. He suggested that the device was actually more convenient than having operators route calls through the main switchboard. He argued that anyone who objected to paying for their own telephone calls was revealing an inappropriate sense of entitlement, but none of these explanations quite satisfied observers, who sensed that the payphone revealed something deeper about Getty's relationship to money, to hospitality, and to the social expectations that attend extreme wealth. Contemporary visitors described the experience of Sutton Place as both magnificent and unsettling. The approach down a mile-long drive past specimen trees planted centuries earlier and deer grazing in parkland that seemed to extend to the horizon built anticipation for the Tudor facade that finally emerged from behind a screen of copper beeches. The entrance through the original gatehouse, with its heraldic carvings and arrow slits, transported visitors backward in time to an England of knights and courtiers. The reception in the great hall, beneath the hammer-beam ceiling that had impressed visitors for 4 centuries, confirmed that one had arrived somewhere truly significant, a place where history accumulated like dust on ancient surfaces. But once inside, the atmosphere grew strange. Getty often conducted meetings in the library while simultaneously reviewing financial documents, his attention divided between his guests and the columns of figures that represented his true interests. Conversations would pause while he studied reports, his responses emerging after delays that suggested his mind was elsewhere, calculating, always calculating, the costs and benefits of whatever was under discussion. Meals in the great hall proceeded with formal ceremony, white-gloved servants, silver service, candlelight reflecting off the ancient paneling. But conversation could be sparse, Getty's contributions limited to brief observations before he returned to contemplation of matters that existed beyond the room. The art collection that Getty assembled at Sutton Place represented his most sustained attempt to create permanence through acquisition. Old masters hung on Tudor walls in combinations that earlier owners could never have afforded. Rubens's sensuous mythologies, Rembrandt's penetrating portraits, Gainsborough's elegant landscapes, and Titian's religious dramas, keeping company with the carved heads and heraldic glass that previous centuries had installed. Getty purchased these works with the same analytical rigor he brought to oil investments, studying provenance, comparing prices, calculating likely appreciation. He saw art as a store of value more reliable than currency, a hedge against the inflation that eroded paper wealth and a marker of cultivation that mere money could not provide. His particular interest lay in the decorative arts, French furniture, tapestries, carpets, and antiquities that he purchased with an eye toward eventual museum display. He acquired pieces that had furnished Versailles and the great houses of the French aristocracy, objects whose provenance connected them to monarchs and ministers whose names still resonated in historical memory. The furniture filled Sutton Place's rooms with 18th-century elegance that contrasted strikingly with Tudor architecture, creating juxtapositions that art historians found fascinating and decorators found problematic. But Getty was not concerned with aesthetic harmony. He was building a collection that would outlast him, using Sutton Place as both residence and staging area for objects that would eventually fill California galleries. The staff at Sutton Place learned to navigate their employer's peculiarities with a combination of professional competence and personal resignation. Getty rose early, ate sparingly. His meals were famously austere, emphasizing economy over pleasure. and devoted most of his waking hours to the management of his business interests. He rarely entertained in the traditional sense. The house parties that had once filled English country estates with guests for shooting weekends and social seasons held no appeal for a man whose idea of pleasure was the successful completion of a transaction. The servants maintained the house in perpetual readiness for gatherings that seldom occurred, polishing silver that would not be used and airing bedrooms that would remain empty. Instead of house parties, visitors came on business, lawyers reviewing contracts, accountants presenting financial statements, oil executives reporting on operations in the Middle East, art dealers offering works for consideration. The stream was steady but purposeful, each arrival connected to some transaction or decision that required Getty's personal attention. The Tudor Great Hall, designed for the communal rituals of medieval hospitality, now served as a setting for negotiations that would have baffled Sir Richard Weston. Discussions of drilling rights, pipeline routes, and refinery capacities conducted beneath a ceiling that had witnessed 5 centuries of English history. Getty's own quarters occupied a modest suite compared to the staterooms available for guests. He preferred a small study overlooking the gardens, furnished with a desk, a telephone, and the ticker machines that brought him continuous updates on oil prices and stock movements. From this room, surrounded by Tudor stone and 16th century craftsmanship, he directed an empire that spanned the modern world: refineries in California, drilling operations in Saudi Arabia, tankers crossing every ocean, pipelines threading through landscapes that Tudor builders could never have imagined. The contrast between setting and activity was absolute. Ancient architecture housing entirely contemporary concerns, historical prestige serving entrepreneurial ambition. He walked the grounds regularly, one of his few concessions to physical activity, accompanied by the dogs that provided more consistent companionship than human visitors. The Alsatians he favored padded beside him on paths that wound through parkland toward the ha-has that separated formal gardens from pasture. The landscape, ancient oaks, rolling lawns, the distant spire of a village church, represented the England that American industrialists had always envied, a permanence rooted in soil and season that no amount of money could create from scratch. Getty had purchased what generations of Americans had admired from afar, not just a house, but a place in the English landscape, a position in the social geography that mere wealth usually could not secure. Yet, even as Getty established himself as Sutton Place's master, he remained fundamentally a visitor in his own home. His American accent never softened despite decades of residence, marking him always as foreign in the country whose traditions he had purchased. His habits never adapted to English rhythms, the country weekends, the sporting seasons, the social calendar that structured aristocratic life. His essential solitude persisted despite the grandeur of his surroundings, the countless rooms and gardens and parkland that enclosed him without ever quite containing him. The house was full of staff, of art, of history, but its owner inhabited it as he'd inhabited the Phantom House in Los Angeles, as a curator rather than a resident, always slightly apart from the life that unfolded within walls he owned but could not quite claim. In rooms hung with old masters, the man obsessed with saving money built a life that could not save his own descendants. On the Malibu coast in 1968, as surveyors marked out a 64-acre hillside in Pacific Palisades, J. Paul Getty commissioned a new building, a museum villa modeled on the Roman Villa dei Papiri, to house his antiquities. The project represented his most ambitious architectural statement, a building designed not for habitation but for legacy. A Roman dream transplanted to California soil, where it might outlast the family that had funded its creation. Getty was 75 years old, increasingly aware of mortality and determined to create something that would preserve his name and his collections long after the complications of family and business had been resolved by time. The Villa dei Papiri had been buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD. Its ruins discovered in the 18th century at Herculaneum during excavations sponsored by the King of Naples. Excavators tunneling through volcanic rock had found not only architecture, but an extensive library of papyrus scrolls, carbonized by the eruption, but potentially readable with techniques that later centuries would develop. The scrolls gave the villa its name and established its reputation as one of the most significant archaeological sites of the ancient world. The building itself represented the height of Roman domestic luxury. Colonnades surrounding a central garden, rooms opening onto courtyards where water features caught the Mediterranean light, walls decorated with frescoes, and floors paved with intricate mosaics. Wealthy Romans had built such villas along the Bay of Naples as retreats from urban pressures, places where philosophy could be discussed and art could be appreciated in settings of cultivated beauty. Getty, who had been collecting Greek and Roman antiquities for decades, saw in this buried villa the perfect container for his treasures. The objects he had assembled, marble sculptures, bronze figures, painted vases, carved gems, had been created for settings like the Villa dei Papiri, rooms where wealthy Romans displayed their cultural acquisitions and demonstrated their sophisticated tastes. Showing such objects in modern museum galleries with their white walls and artificial lighting stripped them of context and meaning. But placing them in a recreation of their original setting would restore something of their intended effect, allowing visitors to experience ancient art as ancient viewers had experienced it. The architects he selected, Robert E. Langdon Jr. and Ernest C. Wilson Jr., faced an unusual challenge. No complete plans of the Villa dei Papiri survived. Excavators had mapped portions of the structure, but much remained buried or destroyed, accessible only through the tunnels that 18th-century workers had driven through solid rock. Getty wanted not a scholarly reconstruction, which would have required inventing details where evidence was lacking, but an evocation, a building that captured the spirit of Roman domestic architecture while serving the practical needs of a modern museum. He worked closely with archaeologist Norman Neuerberg, who served as consultant on historical accuracy, reviewing evidence from Herculaneum and other Roman sites to ensure that the building's details reflected genuine ancient practice. The design process extended over years as Getty and his consultants debated proportions, materials, and decorative schemes. The main peristyle garden, stretching 220 feet, would feature a long reflecting pool surrounded by bronze statues, reproductions of works found at Herculaneum, cast from molds taken from the originals that now resided in the Naples Archaeological Museum. Colonnades lined with columns in the Corinthian order would provide shaded walkways where visitors could move between galleries while remaining connected to the outdoor spaces that were central to Roman domestic life. The herb garden, planted with varieties documented in Roman agricultural treatises, would fill the air with rosemary, bay, and thyme. The same scents that had perfumed the original villa before the eruption buried everything under meters of volcanic ash. Construction began in 1970 and continued for 4 years, transforming the Malibu hillside into something that might have existed on the Bay of Naples 2 millennia earlier. Workers imported marble from Italian quarries that had supplied Roman builders, ensuring that the stone would carry the same colors and textures that ancient architects had specified. Bronze reproductions were cast using methods documented in ancient sources, their patinas carefully controlled to suggest age without falsifying their modern origins. Even the gardens were researched against archaeological evidence of Roman plantings, with species selected to approximate what might have grown at Herculaneum before the mountain destroyed everything. The result was a building that existed in a strange temporal suspension, neither ancient nor modern, neither authentic nor fake, but something unprecedented, a contemporary structure designed to serve as a permanent vessel for ancient objects. The architecture made no claim to be Roman. Visitors could see modern materials and construction techniques wherever they looked closely. But the overall effect was persuasive, transporting viewers into an imaginative space where the distinction between past and present seemed to blur. Walking through the peristyle garden, with the reflecting pool stretching toward colonnades and mountains visible beyond, one could almost believe that the Pacific was the Mediterranean, that the California sun was Italian sun, that 2,000 years had somehow been compressed into a single architectural experience. Inside, the galleries were designed to display antiquities in settings that suggested their original contexts. Greek vases stood in alcoves that evoked domestic shrines, their painted scenes visible at the distance and angle for which ancient artists had designed them. Roman portraits lined corridors that recalled the atria of patrician houses, where ancestors' images had proclaimed family dignity and historical continuity. The lighting, carefully controlled to protect fragile objects from the ultraviolet radiation that destroys pigments and degrades organic materials, nonetheless aimed to approximate the natural illumination that would have filtered through Roman courtyards, soft, directional, varying with the time of day. Getty himself never saw the completed villa. By the time construction was finished in January 1974, he had become increasingly reclusive at Sutton Place, his health declining and his attention fixed on the business arrangements that would determine his legacy after death. He reviewed photographs and reports, approved expenditures and acquisitions, but the building that bore his name, that was designed specifically to embody his vision of cultural permanence, remained an abstraction, images on paper rather than spaces he could walk through. The irony was characteristic. Getty had created the ultimate expression of his aesthetic philosophy, and he experienced it only at a distance, mediated through the same documentary processes that governed his relationships with family members scattered across continents. The villa opened to the public in January 1974, and critics found themselves divided. Some praised the attempt to recreate classical architecture with scholarly attention to detail, calling it a serious contribution to public understanding of ancient life. Others dismissed it as a rich man's fantasy, a Disneyland version of antiquity that confused reproduction with authenticity and spectacle with scholarship. The museum's own later publications would acknowledge that during the Villa era, the institution was better known for its Roman imperial architecture than for its collections. The building itself had become the primary exhibit, overshadowing the objects it was meant to serve. Yet the villa's architecture also embodied Getty's deepest beliefs about the relationship between art and permanence. He had watched buildings disappear, the Phantom House demolished for an office tower, Sutton Place destined for other owners after his death, and understood that structures designed for private use carried an inherent fragility. Personal residences served personal purposes, and when those purposes ended, the buildings became vulnerable to whatever the market or circumstances demanded. A museum was different. A museum existed to preserve and display, to maintain objects in stable conditions across generations, to outlast the individuals who funded it. By housing his collection in a Roman villa, Getty was claiming a lineage that stretched back 20 centuries, suggesting that what he had built participated in an unbroken tradition of civilized collecting that connected California to Herculaneum, to the origins of Western culture itself. The setting reinforced this claim with every visual detail. The Pacific coast, visible from the villa's terraces, recalled the Mediterranean coastline that Roman builders had known. The California light, clear and golden, approximated the sunshine that had illuminated the original Villa dei Papiri before Vesuvius cast its shadow. The mountains visible in the distance, the Santa Monica Range, stood in for Vesuvius itself, dormant but present, a reminder that even the most permanent-seeming structures exist at the pleasure of geological forces beyond human control. Visitors arriving from modern Los Angeles found themselves transported not just to another time, but to another way of thinking about time itself, one in which art objects moved through centuries while human generations passed like shadows on a Roman garden wall. Getty's decision to create this vessel in California rather than England or Italy reflected practical considerations that his business mind could not ignore. California's art market, increasingly sophisticated as the state's wealth grew, offered opportunities for acquisition that older markets did not. The climate, mild and stable, reduced the engineering challenges of maintaining proper conditions for fragile objects. And the legal framework of American philanthropy, with its tax advantages for charitable donations and its protections for nonprofit institutions, provided the organizational structure that would allow the museum to persist beyond Getty's lifetime. But the California location also represented a return to the landscape where his fortune had been made. The oil that funded the villa came substantially from California wells. The same geological formations that had made Getty rich now supported the cultural enterprise that would preserve his name. The museum's endowment would grow from California-based businesses, from investments managed in Los Angeles and San Francisco, from the continuing productivity of the American economy that had enabled Getty's rise. In building a Roman villa above the Pacific, Getty was grafting classical aspirations onto American entrepreneurial success, suggesting that the two traditions could be synthesized into something new and permanent. The villa's engineering anticipated threats that would test it decades later. Fire-resistant construction, specified after consultation with experts who understood Southern California's burn cycles, protected against the wildfires that regularly swept through the Santa Monica Mountains. Advanced climate control maintained stable temperature and humidity regardless of exterior conditions. Security systems, designed with the same attention that protected his oil installations, guarded against theft of objects whose value exceeded what most people could comprehend. The building was conceived as a fortress, beautiful on its surface, but defended at its core against the disasters that had destroyed so many monuments before it. This defensive architecture would prove prescient when wildfires approached in subsequent years, testing the systems that Getty's planners had specified. By the time Getty died at Sutton Place in June 1976, the villa had established itself as one of Southern California's major cultural attractions. Visitors parked in hillside lots, rode shuttles to the entrance, and emerged into a world that seemed to exist outside American time. Columns, fountains, bronze athletes, and the distant glitter of the Pacific. They experienced what Getty had imagined but never witnessed, his collection displayed in a setting that suggested its objects had always belonged there, that Roman art had somehow found its natural home on a California hillside above the Pacific Coast Highway. The paradox of the villa was that it succeeded precisely because its creator remained absent. Getty's personality, his coldness, his parsimony, his emotional distance from nearly everyone who sought his attention, would have complicated any experience of his home. Visitors to Sutton Place often left feeling unsettled, their memories of Tudor magnificence shadowed by memories of a host who seemed to resent their presence. But a museum carries no such baggage. Visitors encountered only the beauty Getty had assembled, the spaces he had commissioned, the vision of classical permanence he had worked to realize. The man himself had been edited out of the experience, leaving only his taste and his resources as evidence that he had ever existed. From the shaded loggia of the Getty Villa, the marble basin at the pool's edge catches the light exactly as its designers intended. Water moves through channels that replicate Roman hydraulics. Bronze figures cast shadows that shift with the sun. And somewhere in the background, climate control systems hum quietly, maintaining the stable environment that ancient objects require to survive. Getty had built a machine for preserving the past, and that machine continued to function long after its builder had joined the ancients he collected. While marble gods watched the ocean, the family whose name crowned the pediment was already drifting apart. By 1953, when J. Paul Getty established the J. Paul Getty Museum Trust, the collection in Pacific Palisades had begun to rival small European museums, even as his 5 sons scattered across continents in patterns that suggested flight rather than expansion. The legal structure that would eventually govern billions in assets started modestly. A California nonprofit with an initial focus on the art and antiquities that Getty had been accumulating since the 1930s. But the Trust's creation also marked a fundamental shift in Getty's priorities, a formal acknowledgement that objects would receive the care and attention that people, apparently, would not. The documents filed with California authorities represented Getty's clearest statement about what mattered to him, collections that could be cataloged, preserved, and displayed, not relationships that required the messy work of emotional engagement. The original museum occupied Getty's ranch house on the Malibu property, a relatively modest structure that he had converted into gallery space in 1954. The building had been constructed as a residence, its rooms scaled for domestic use, and its circulation designed for family life, rather than public visitation. Converting it to museum purposes required compromises that professionals found frustrating. Doorways too narrow for large paintings, ceilings too low for monumental sculpture, climate control systems improvised from residential equipment never designed for archival preservation. But Getty insisted on the conversion, unwilling to wait for purpose-built facilities when he had objects requiring display and a public increasingly curious about the collections of the richest American. Visitors to the Ranch House Museum experienced an intimacy that later Getty institutions would lack. They walked through rooms that still bore traces of their domestic origins, a fireplace in what had been a living room, windows positioned to frame views that a homeowner would have appreciated, proportions that suggested comfort rather than grandeur. The art objects displayed in these spaces achieved a scale relationship with viewers that formal galleries often destroyed. Greek vases designed for use in ancient households appeared in something like their intended context. Small bronzes that would have been lost in museum halls achieved proper prominence on mantels and side tables. Getty himself, increasingly based at Sutton Place, viewed his California museum as a kind of proxy presence, a way of maintaining connection to the land where his fortune had originated. He could not be there himself. His business affairs and his temperament both prevented extended residence. But his collection could occupy the space in his absence, representing his taste and his values to visitors who would never meet him. The arrangement suited his preference for mediated relationships, for connections maintained at safe distances where emotional demands could be controlled. At Sutton Place, meanwhile, a parallel accumulation continued with growing intensity. The great hall filled with paintings that needed proper climate control, works by masters whose names commanded instant recognition and instant respect. Rubens, Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Titian, and dozens of lesser but still significant artists found places on Tudor walls that had been bare or decorated only with family portraits for previous centuries. The collection transformed Sutton Place from an aristocratic residence into something more complex, a private museum masquerading as a home, a display of cultural capital that exceeded what most public institutions could assemble. The library that stretched 140 feet along the garden front housed books and manuscripts that required careful conservation. Getty had begun acquiring rare books with the same systematic approach he brought to paintings and antiquities, building a collection that ranged from medieval illuminated manuscripts to first editions of works that had shaped Western thought. The volumes filled custom-built shelves that lined the gallery's enormous length, their spines creating patterns of leather and gilt that visitors found simultaneously impressive and overwhelming. To walk the length of the Sutton Place Library was to traverse centuries of European intellectual history, compressed into a single architectural space by the purchasing power of American oil wealth. The trust documents from this era reveal Getty's characteristic attention to administrative detail. Provisions specified how objects should be cataloged, with requirements for photography, measurement, and provenance research that anticipated professional standards that many museums had not yet adopted. Insurance protocols detailed coverage amounts, approved carriers, and procedures for claims in the event of damage or loss. Acquisition policies established criteria for evaluating potential purchases. Quality, condition, authenticity, and price all weighed against the collection's existing strengths and identified gaps. The language was precise, legal, and comprehensive. The same care that Getty brought to oil leases and corporate acquisitions applied now to matters of cultural patrimony. What the documents did not address, because legal instruments cannot address such things, was the contrast between this meticulous provision for objects and the relative neglect that characterized Getty's relationships with his children. His 5 sons, George Franklin, Jean Ronald, Eugene Paul, Gordon Peter, and Timothy, each navigated their father's wealth and indifference in different ways, finding strategies for survival that reflected their individual temperaments and circumstances. The inheritance they shared was not primarily financial, though the money was substantial. It was psychological, a legacy of emotional unavailability that shaped their lives as decisively as the trust documents shaped the museum's future. George Franklin Getty II, the eldest, had worked in his father's oil businesses and seemed positioned for succession until his death in 1973. The circumstances remained subject to interpretation. Some accounts suggested suicide, others accident or illness. But the outcome removed the son who had been most closely integrated into Getty's business operations. George's death preceded the kidnapping that would define the family's public image, adding another layer of tragedy to a story that was already accumulating sorrows at an alarming rate. Jean Ronald Getty, the second son, pursued a business career that kept him largely outside the family dramas. He maintained distance from his father's enterprises and from the complications that surrounded his siblings, constructing a life that minimized contact with the sources of family wealth and family pain. His relative invisibility in the Getty narrative reflected a deliberate strategy of self-protection, a recognition that proximity to the family's resources brought proximity to its dysfunctions. Eugene Paul Getty Jr., who would later become Sir Paul Getty after receiving British knighthood, struggled with addiction and trauma that the family's wealth seemed only to amplify. His first wife's death, his son's kidnapping, his own descent into heroin dependence, each catastrophe unfolded against backdrops of architectural splendor that made the human suffering more stark by contrast. The beautiful houses he inhabited during his bohemian years could not protect him from the consequences of inherited pain and acquired dependencies. Gordon Peter Getty, the fourth son, would eventually emerge as the most visible Getty of his generation, but only after protracted legal battles over the trust's governance that consumed years and produced headlines. His relationship with his father had been complicated by Getty's evident preference for other sons, by conflicts over business strategy and personal style, by the fundamental incompatibility between a father who measured everything in financial terms and a son whose interests lay in music, philosophy, and pursuits that produced no obvious return on investment. Timothy Getty, the youngest, born to Getty's fifth wife, died in 1958 at age 12 from surgical complications, a loss that registered differently for a father whose emotional connections to his children were always attenuated. The boy had barely known his father, who spent most of Timothy's short life at Sutton Place, while the child remained in California with his mother. The death added to the accumulating evidence that Getty wealth could not protect against the ordinary vulnerabilities of human life. The pattern that emerged across these five sons and their own children suggested that Getty's approach to family resembled his approach to real estate: assets to be managed, obligations to be minimized, emotional investments to be avoided whenever possible. The same man who would spend hours evaluating the provenance of a Roman sculpture, tracing its ownership through centuries, and verifying its authenticity through exhaustive research, showed little interest in the provenance of his own descendants, their struggles, their achievements, their needs for recognition and support. The trust that preserved his collections offered no equivalent structure for preserving his family. There were no documents specifying how children should be raised, no protocols for emotional support, no acquisition policies for relationships. The legal frameworks that governed his cultural philanthropy existed alongside a vacuum where family governance should have been, and into that vacuum flowed the chaos that money amplifies but cannot control. Yet Getty was not simply cruel. Those who knew him described a man incapable of certain forms of emotional expression rather than one who deliberately withheld them. His childhood had been isolated, his education focused on business, his adult life consumed by the single-minded pursuit of wealth that left little room for the cultivation of interpersonal skills. The capacities required for intimacy, vulnerability, presence, sustained attention to another person's inner life, had simply never developed, atrophied by disuse, or perhaps never present in the first place. Buildings and objects offered what people could not: stable relationships governed by clear rules, with no expectations of reciprocity. A painting required proper lighting, appropriate humidity, and protection from physical damage. Meet these requirements, and the painting remained beautiful indefinitely. A building required maintenance, repair, and thoughtful stewardship. Provide these services, and the building preserved its value across generations. Human relationships demanded something more: attention, adjustment, the constant renegotiation of expectations that characterizes all genuine intimacy. And Getty found these demands exhausting in ways that business negotiations never were. The museum in California continued to grow throughout the 1960s, its collections expanding beyond antiquities to include European paintings, decorative arts, and manuscripts. Each acquisition was documented, photographed, and integrated into a catalog that grew more sophisticated as the trust professionalized its operations. Curators replaced informal advisors, conservation specialists replaced generalist caretakers, educational programs replaced casual docent tours. By the time the Getty Villa opened in 1974, the collection had achieved international significance, a body of work that demanded serious scholarly attention and justified the architectural extravagance of its setting. The trust that governed this expanding enterprise embodied Getty's vision of permanence in ways that his family could not. Institutions outlast individuals. Properly endowed, properly governed, properly focused on their missions, they continue across generations while the humans who founded them pass into history. Getty understood this principle instinctively, applying to cultural philanthropy the same long-term thinking that had built his oil fortune. He was constructing something that would bear his name for centuries, long after the complications of his family life had been forgotten or reduced to footnotes in biographies that emphasized his achievements rather than his failures. In the trust documents, the galleries are meticulously provided for. The grandchildren are another matter. In the late 1960s, an elegant townhouse at 16 Cheney Walk, Chelsea, and a Moorish palace in Morocco became backdrops for the marriage of John Paul Getty Jr. and Talitha Paul, a union that represented everything the elder Getty's world was not: bohemian rather than businesslike, artistic rather than acquisitive, public in its pleasures rather than private in its calculations. The buildings they inhabited reflected this departure, offering spaces designed for beauty and experience rather than preservation and control. Where Sutton Place projected stability and tradition, the younger Getty's residences projected improvisation and sensuality. Rooms arranged for parties rather than business meetings, decorated for visual pleasure rather than investment value. The Cheney Walk house stood in one of London's most storied addresses, a Georgian terrace along the Thames where the 19th century's most celebrated artists and writers had gathered. The pre-Raphaelite painter Dante Gabriel Rossetti had lived at number 16, filling its rooms with exotic animals, medieval furniture, and the models whose features appeared in his paintings of mythological and literary subjects. The house retained associations with that romantic era, its high ceilings and river views suggesting a bohemian tradition that the young Gettys were eager to continue. Getty Jr. had inherited his father's means but not his temperament. Where the elder Getty conserved and accumulated, the son spent and distributed. Where the father preferred solitude and control, the son sought company and spontaneity. The differences were not merely personal, they were philosophical, reflecting fundamentally opposed ideas about what wealth was for. The elder Getty believed that money existed to be grown, protected, and eventually converted into permanent cultural institutions that would outlast individual mortality. The son believed that money existed to be enjoyed, shared with friends, and converted into experiences that made life worth living in the present rather than the future. Talitha Paul had arrived in Getty Jr.'s life as an embodiment of 1960s glamour, a woman whose beauty and style made her the subject of fashion photography and society coverage. Dutch Indonesian by birth, educated in London's artistic circles, possessed of a presence that photographers found irresistible, she represented a new kind of celebrity, famous for being beautiful and interesting rather than for any particular achievement. Her wedding to Getty Jr. in 1966 had been covered extensively in the society pages, and the couple's lifestyle became an object of fascination for a generation that was redefining what wealthy lives could look like. The Cheney Walk house, during these years, functioned as salon, gallery, and gathering place for an international set that included rock musicians, fashion designers, artists, and the various hangers-on that such milieus attract. The Rolling Stones visited. Fashion photographers set up shoots. Artists displayed work on walls that Rossetti had known. The rooms filled with Talitha's bohemian furnishings, Persian carpets layered on wooden floors, Indian textiles draped over sofas, candles burning in silver holders that might have been antique or might have been purchased the previous week in Portobello Road. The aesthetic was eclectic, sensual, and deliberately opposed to the formal grandeur of Sutton Place. But the couple's most famous residence was not in London at all. In Marrakesh, they acquired what contemporary accounts described as a Moorish palace, a traditional riad with courtyard gardens, geometric tilework, and roof, terraces overlooking the Medina. This was the Morocco that attracted Western artists and seekers in the 1960s, a North African fantasy of ancient mysteries and available pleasures that the counterculture found irresistible. The city offered what European capitals could not: sunshine, exoticism, cheap living for those with Western currencies, and a relaxed attitude toward substances and behaviors that remained illegal or stigmatized elsewhere. The Getty household in Marrakesh became a magnet for visitors seeking both beauty and escape. The parties they hosted entered legend, described in memoirs and magazine articles, as gatherings where international celebrities mingled with local artists, where drugs circulated freely, where the boundaries between guest and host, day and night, reality and fantasy blurred into continuous celebration. The palace's architecture, its courtyards open to the sky, its rooms arranged around gardens where fountains played, its rooftop terraces commanding views of minarets and mountains, provided the perfect setting for lives organized around pleasure rather than purpose. Contemporary photographs captured the aesthetic that made the Gettys icons of their era. Talitha posed on the rooftop terrace in flowing caftans, the Atlas Mountains visible in the distance, her beauty frozen in images that would circulate for decades as symbols of an era's glamour. The photographs appeared in Vogue and other fashion magazines, establishing Talitha as a style icon whose influence would persist long after her death. Her combination of Western sophistication and Eastern exoticism, of wealth and unconventionality, of beauty and apparent accessibility, made her the model for a generation of women who wanted to live differently than their mothers had lived. The rooms behind her, visible in other photographs, showed the same layered eclecticism as Cheyne Walk, but with Moroccan elements replacing Victorian ones. Brass lanterns cast intricate shadows on whitewashed walls. Carved wooden mashrabia screens filtered sunlight into geometric patterns. Zeliga tilework in blues and greens covered surfaces that Western decoration would have left plain. Low tables surrounded by cushions replaced formal dining arrangements. The aesthetic rejected the separation between decoration and life that characterized bourgeois European interiors, creating spaces where every surface invited touch and every corner suggested possibility. The reality behind the photographs was darker than the images suggested. Both Talitha and Getty Jr. had been drawn into heroin addiction, a progression that their wealth facilitated rather than prevented. Money made drugs available in unlimited quantities. Money made it possible to maintain appearances even as dependency deepened. Money insulated them from consequences that would have forced less privileged users to confront their problems or die quickly. Friends who visited the Marrakesh house during these years described beauty and chaos intermingled, exquisite furnishings alongside evidence of disorder, perfect hospitality interrupted by episodes of incapacity, conversations that veered from brilliant to incoherent as substances took their toll. Getty Jr.'s relationship with his father during these years was strained by more than geographical distance. The elder Getty disapproved of his son's lifestyle, his artistic friends, his apparently purposeless existence amid such material abundance. Letters between them, when they communicated at all, carried the chill of mutual incomprehension. The father had built his life around control and accumulation. The son seemed determined to spend and dissipate. Their respective houses, Sutton Place's Tudor discipline versus Marrakesh's sensual disorder, embodied the conflict perfectly. The bohemian houses of the younger Gettys replaced Sutton Place's restraints with apparent freedom, but they repeated the same pattern in a different key. Spectacular architecture, unable to stabilize lives lived inside it. The Moorish palace was beautiful, but it was not safe. The freedom it offered was the freedom to self-destruct in beautiful surroundings, to pursue pleasures that destroyed the capacity for pleasure, to create experiences that ended in oblivion rather than memory. Talitha's death in July 1971 marked the end of this particular chapter in Getty architectural history. She was found in a Rome apartment where the couple had been staying, having overdosed on what the death certificate described as alcohol and barbiturates, though later examination revealed traces of heroin as well. She was 30 years old. The Marrakesh Palace, the Cheney Walk House, the entire elaborate stage set of their bohemian existence, all of it suddenly appeared in different light. The beauty had been real, but so had the destruction it concealed. The Guardian's obituary would later describe Talitha as a hopeless addict who died of a heroin overdose in Italy in 1971, framing her life as a cautionary tale about excess and its consequences. But the architectural evidence suggested something more complex than simple cautionary narrative. The houses she had inhabited were genuinely beautiful, genuinely innovative, genuinely influential in the development of bohemian style that would filter into mainstream design over the following decades. Her eye for space and texture and light had created environments that visitors remembered decades later. The tragedy was not that beauty proved false, but that it proved insufficient, unable to protect those who created it from the forces that destroyed them. From Chelsea to Marrakesh, the rooms were beautiful. The people in them were not safe. Just after 3 a.m. on July 10, 1973, 16-year-old John Paul Getty III was seized in Rome's Piazza Farnese. By December, as he lay held in a mountain hideout in Calabria, the telephones at Sutton Place finally rang with news that his ear had been cut off and mailed to a newspaper. The kidnapping became one of the decade's most notorious crimes, a drama that played out across 2 continents and multiple architectural settings: Roman piazzas, mountain caves, Tudor corridors, each space carrying its own weight in the unfolding tragedy. The Piazza Farnese, where young Getty was taken, represents one of Rome's most beautiful urban spaces, a Renaissance square dominated by the Palazzo Farnese and adorned with fountain basins carved from ancient Roman baths. The teenager had been living in Rome largely on his own, his parents separated, and his father lost to addiction following Talitha's death 2 years earlier. The boy supported himself by selling jewelry and paintings in the Porta Portese market and had cultivated connections with the city's demi-monde, artists, radicals, and others who existed on society's margins. His disappearance initially seemed like it might be a prank or a publicity stunt. Young Getty had previously joked about staging his own kidnapping, but the ransom demand of $17 million announced that the crime was genuine. The kidnappers, members of the 'Ndrangheta, the Calabrian organized crime syndicate, had identified their target with precision. The Getty name guaranteed global attention. The family's wealth suggested that any demand, however extravagant, might be met. The teenager was worth more as a kidnapping victim than most people accumulate in a lifetime of labor. The response from Sutton Place, 23 miles from London, took weeks to fully articulate. J. Paul Getty Sr., then 80 years old and increasingly isolated in his Tudor fortress, initially refused to negotiate. His statement to the press became the most quoted words of the entire saga. "I have 14 other grandchildren. If I pay 1 penny, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." The logic was cold but internally consistent. Paying ransom would establish a precedent that endangered every member of the extended family. What the logic did not acknowledge was the boy currently held in Calabria, his fate suspended while his grandfather calculated risks and precedents in a Tudor library lined with priceless books. The architecture of Sutton Place during these months acquired new significance. The Great Hall, where Getty received visitors and conducted business, became the setting for negotiations conducted through intermediaries. The long library witnessed telephone calls that connected Surrey to Rome to the mountains of southern Italy. The Minstrels Gallery, designed for Tudor entertainments, looked down on discussions about ransom amounts, proof of life requirements, and the mechanics of transferring millions across international borders. The house that had been built for feasting and celebration now served as command center for a crisis that would define Getty's memory for generations. The pay telephone, which had seemed merely eccentric, acquired new resonance in this context. Getty's instinct to control and minimize expenditure, to resist the demands that others placed on his resources, to calculate the cost of every transaction, all of it now appeared as pieces of a worldview that could accommodate his grandson's ear as an acceptable loss in the calculus of family security. The Tudor walls that had witnessed centuries of English history now witnessed something unprecedented: a grandfather choosing principle and precedent over a mutilated child. Meanwhile, in Calabria, the teenager experienced architecture of a very different kind. His captors held him in a series of locations, including what survivors and investigators later described as mountain huts, rough stone walls, earthen floors, conditions that contrasted absolutely with the Tudor comfort of Sutton Place. He was blindfolded much of the time, chained when his captors felt insecure, fed erratically. The 5 months of his captivity stretched across seasons, from the heat of Roman summer to the chill of southern Italian autumn. The mutilation came in October. When negotiations stalled and Getty Sr. continued to resist payment, the kidnappers decided to increase pressure dramatically. They cut off the boy's right ear, some accounts say with a razor, others with scissors, and mailed it to the Roman daily Il Messaggero, accompanied by a lock of his hair and a note threatening further mutilation if the ransom was not paid. Postal delays meant that the package did not arrive for weeks, during which time the family could not know what had happened. When the ear finally surfaced, its impact was immediate and profound. The severed ear forced a resolution that negotiation had failed to achieve. Getty Sr. agreed to pay what his advisors determined was the maximum tax-deductible amount, approximately $2.2 million, and to lend the remainder of the reduced ransom to his son, Getty Jr., at 4% interest. The arrangement allowed the grandfather to maintain his position that he would not personally pay ransom, while nonetheless providing the funds that secured the boy's release. The legal and financial maneuvering was intricate, designed to satisfy Getty's principles while achieving the practical outcome that circumstances required. The boy was released in December 1973, found at a service station in southern Italy after his captors deposited him there in the pre-dawn darkness. He was physically damaged, the ear wound had healed poorly, infection had set in, and the psychological trauma would take years to fully manifest. But he was alive, and his survival allowed everyone involved to claim some form of victory. The family had retrieved its heir, the kidnappers had collected their ransom, the press had a story that would sustain interest for decades. In the photographs from Sutton Place during this period, the house looks unchanged. The formal gardens maintain their geometric precision. The great hall's hammer beam ceiling continues its medieval ascent. The long library's volumes remain properly shelved. Nothing in the architecture acknowledges what transpired within its walls during those 5 months, what decisions were made in its rooms, what telephone calls echoed through its corridors. The house absorbed the drama and continued as before, permanent in ways that human relationships could not match. In the photographs, the house looks unchanged. In the family, nothing would ever be the same again. In 1984, high above the San Diego freeway on a chaparral-covered hill in Brentwood, architect Richard Meyer began to sketch a new campus for the J. Paul Getty Trust, a project that would open to the public on December 16, 1997, as the Getty Center. The commission represented one of the largest and most prestigious architectural projects of the late 20th century, a billion-dollar institution designed to consolidate Getty's various cultural initiatives into a single hilltop complex that would dominate the Los Angeles landscape and proclaim the transformation of private fortune into public benefit. Getty had died in 1976, leaving an estate that made the trust one of the wealthiest cultural institutions in the world. The legal battles over his will consumed years. Family members contested provisions, challenged interpretations, and sought larger shares of an estate that proved far more valuable than anyone had anticipated. But eventually, the trust emerged with resources that demanded expenditure. Tax law required foundations to spend significant portions of their assets on charitable purposes, and the Getty Trust's assets were so enormous that even the legally required minimums translated into hundreds of millions of dollars annually. The trustees faced a decision that would shape the institution's identity for generations. They could have distributed funds to existing museums and cultural organizations, becoming philanthropists who supported others' work rather than creators of their own institutions. They could have focused exclusively on the existing Getty properties, enhancing the villa and supporting the programs it housed. Instead, they chose to build something entirely new, a campus that would consolidate research, conservation, education, and exhibition in a single location designed to announce the Getty's emergence as a dominant force in global cultural affairs. Meyer won the commission through a competition that attracted international attention. His design proposed a campus of interconnected pavilions clad in travertine stone imported from quarries near Rome, specifically from Bani di Tivoli, where Roman builders had sourced material for the Colosseum and countless other ancient structures. The choice deliberately connected the new Getty Center to the classical traditions embodied in the Getty Villa, creating an architectural dialogue between the Roman recreation in Malibu and the modernist interpretation in Brentwood. The travertine became the project's defining material. More than 16,000 tons of stone were quarried in Italy, shipped across the Atlantic, and installed on the building's facades. The stone's natural variation, fossils embedded in its surface, geological striations recording millions of years of accumulation, provided organic warmth that balanced the building's modernist geometries. Workers cut and finished each panel to specifications that allowed for controlled variation, creating surfaces that shifted in color and texture as light conditions changed throughout the day. The effect was neither uniform nor random, but carefully calibrated, achieving a kind of regulated naturalism that reflected the institution's combination of artistic aspiration and bureaucratic organization. The site itself presented extraordinary challenges and opportunities. The 110-acre property rose from the freeway corridor to a ridgetop commanding views across the entire Los Angeles basin, from the Pacific Ocean to the San Gabriel Mountains, from the towers of downtown to the canyons of Malibu. Building on such terrain required extensive geological study, elaborate foundations, and careful attention to seismic safety. The Getty Trust's resources made it possible to address these challenges with engineering solutions that few other clients could have afforded, creating a campus that would remain stable through the earthquakes that periodically remind Los Angeles of its geological precariousness. The landscape design, developed by artist Robert Irwin in collaboration with the project team, proved equally ambitious. The central garden occupied a ravine at the heart of the campus, transforming a natural depression into an elaborate composition of plants, water, and stone. Irwin described his creation as a sculpture in the form of a garden aspiring to be art, a characterization that some found pretentious and others found perfectly accurate. A stream ran through the garden's length, dropping through a series of cascades before collecting in a circular pool at the bottom. The plantings, carefully selected for color, texture, and seasonal variation, created an ever-changing canvas that contrasted with the building's geometric permanence. The Getty Center that opened in December 1997 represented something unprecedented in American cultural life. A private institution with resources exceeding those of most national museums, housed in a purpose-built campus that proclaimed its ambitions through architectural scale and quality. Visitors who rode the tram from the parking structure at the hill's base emerged onto a campus that seemed designed as a refuge from the city spreading below. The white buildings, the careful landscaping, the commanding views, all contributed to an experience that felt removed from ordinary urban life. Critics noted the fortress-like quality of the complex, its separation from surrounding neighborhoods, its implicit message about the relationship between cultural institutions and the communities they serve. The center could be reached only by the tram that climbed the hillside, its access controlled and its perimeter defined. The architecture created a world apart, a cultural sanctuary that demanded effort to enter and offered no casual passage through. For some observers, this separation represented cultural elitism made architectural, a billion-dollar monument to the idea that art requires protection from the masses who might want to experience it. But visitors responded enthusiastically to the beauty of the setting, the quality of the collections, and the sophistication of the programming. Attendance exceeded projections from the opening weeks, as Los Angeles residents discovered that their city now contained a cultural resource to rival any in the world. The Getty Center became a destination not just for art lovers, but for tourists, for families seeking weekend outings, for couples on dates, for anyone who wanted to experience the combination of art, architecture, and landscape that the Hilltop campus provided. The center's design incorporated extensive fire protection systems, reflecting the reality that Southern California's hillsides burn with regularity. A 1 million-gallon water tank provided emergency supply. Fire-resistant plantings replaced native chaparral on the hillsides surrounding the buildings. The travertine and concrete construction eliminated combustible materials from the structures themselves. Interior fire doors could seal galleries to protect collections from smoke damage. A helipad allowed emergency access when roads became impassable. Staff described the complex as the safest place for art during a fire. High above Los Angeles, a travertine citadel promised stability that the family below never found. By 1957, wrecking crews on South Irving Boulevard reduced the former Getty mansion to rubble, clearing ground for the Tidewater oil building. By the early 2000s, even Sutton Place's estate was being subdivided for new owners. The physical disappearance of Getty houses mirrored the erosion of the family's coherence, architecture proving just as vulnerable to redevelopment and corporate calculation as any business asset. The buildings that had seemed permanent, that had been designed and constructed to project stability and significance, vanished or transformed according to logics that their original owners could not have anticipated and would not have approved. The demolition of the Phantom House proceeded with the efficiency that characterized Los Angeles development in the post-war decades. The city had no meaningful preservation laws, no cultural infrastructure for protecting buildings simply because they were beautiful or historically significant. Property existed to serve purposes, and when purposes changed, property could be altered or destroyed without ceremony. Bulldozers arrived on a spring morning in 1957, workmen secured perimeters to protect passers-by from falling debris, and within weeks, the Mediterranean Revival mansion that had sheltered Hollywood fantasies and Getty ambitions had been reduced to foundation remnants and hauled away rubble. The swimming pool, where James Dean had filmed his knife fight in Rebel Without a Cause, was filled with broken concrete and construction waste. The grand staircase that Gloria Swanson had descended in her deranged final close-up was hauled to a landfill somewhere in the sprawling Los Angeles basin. T. Beverly Came Jr.'s architectural vision, already decades past its cultural moment by 1957, disappeared with minimal ceremony and less documentation. No architectural historian recorded the demolition. No photographer created a systematic record of the building's last days. The Phantom House simply ceased to exist, its absence noted only by neighbors who remembered what had stood on the site and by film historians who recognized its appearances in two of Hollywood's most iconic productions. Local opposition had been present but insufficient to affect the outcome. Windsor Square residents who had watched their neighborhood transform from an enclave of distinguished residences to an increasingly commercial district protested the demolition in letters to newspapers and at city council meetings. They argued that the mansion represented an irreplaceable example of 1920s residential architecture, that its associations with significant films gave it cultural importance, that its destruction would diminish the neighborhood's character and property values. But the property belonged to Getty interests, and Getty interests had determined that an office building would serve better than a mansion that had outlived its usefulness. No law prevented an owner from demolishing his own property, and sentiment, however genuinely felt, could not compete with commercial calculation. The Tidewater oil building that replaced the Phantom House represented the post-war corporate aesthetic that was transforming American cities. Clean lines, efficient floor plates, parking structures to accommodate automobile commuters. The building embodied functional priorities that made no accommodation for beauty, history, or neighborhood character. It erased not just the Jenkins mansion, but the entire visual history of its site, replacing Mediterranean romance with corporate anonymity. Workers who entered its lobby each morning, who spent their careers in its offices and corridors, had no knowledge of what had preceded them, no awareness that they occupied ground where a haunted palace had once gathered legends. Getty himself seems to have been indifferent to the loss. By 1957, his attention had shifted decisively to European acquisitions, to the art collections that increasingly defined his public identity, and to the English estate that would serve as his principal residence until his death. The Phantom House belonged to a phase of his life that had passed. The years of establishing himself in California, of building his American reputation, of competing with other oil magnates for social position in a city that respected wealth above almost everything else. Now he wanted something different. Historical legitimacy, European culture, the patina of age that new money could purchase but not create. The office tower on Irving Boulevard continues to conduct its business today, unremarkable among the commercial structures that line Wilshire's arterials. No historical marker identifies the site as the place where a haunted mansion once gathered legends, where Gloria Swanson descended into madness, where James Dean fought for his soul in an empty swimming pool. The architectural memory has been erased as thoroughly as if it had never existed. Only in film archives, where the studio productions that used the location are preserved, does the Phantom House continue to exist, frozen in black and white, its balconies and staircases serving stories that outlasted the building itself. Across the Atlantic, Sutton Place's transformation proceeded more gradually, but with similar results. After Getty's death in 1976, the Tudor estate passed through various ownership arrangements, each one distancing the property further from its Getty associations. The will had not specified that the house should become a museum, or that it should be preserved in anything like its Getty-era condition. It was simply another asset in an estate of unprecedented size, to be disposed of according to the trustee's judgment about how best to serve the trust's charitable purposes. The 174-acre parkland that had provided Getty's walking grounds was subdivided into smaller parcels over the following decades. Some were sold to developers who built modern houses on land where 16th-century gardens had once spread. Others were sold to neighboring estates seeking to expand their holdings. The views that Getty had enjoyed, the long perspectives across English countryside that had given Sutton Place its country house character, were interrupted by new construction that previous owners could not have imagined. The main house survived. Its Grade 1 listed status, the highest level of protection in English heritage law, prevented demolition or significant alteration of the Tudor structure. But legal protection could not prevent change of ownership, change of use, change of atmosphere. The house that had been Getty's fortress, where he had made the decision about his grandson's ransom and entertained visitors with the pay telephone's message of calculated frugality, became simply another large English house available to whoever could afford its purchase price and maintenance costs. By the early 21st century, Sutton Place had passed into the ownership of Alisher Usmanov, an Uzbek-Russian billionaire whose fortune derived from metals and telecommunications, industries that Getty could not have imagined when he purchased the property in 1959. The new owner undertook extensive renovations, updating the Tudor structure with modern amenities while preserving its historical features under the watchful oversight of heritage authorities. The Great Hall remained, as did the long library and the principal reception rooms that had impressed visitors for 5 centuries. But the character of ownership had shifted fundamentally, from American oil wealth to post-Soviet commodity wealth, from one form of global capital to another. The renovations at Sutton Place, under later ownership, reflected expectations that had evolved since Getty's time. Central heating systems were comprehensively upgraded, ensuring that guests would not shiver in bedrooms where Tudor fireplaces had provided inadequate warmth. Kitchens were relocated and modernized, their equipment capable of producing meals that would arrive at dining tables still warm. The servants' quarters were converted to other uses as the nature of domestic service changed and the Victorian armies of below-stairs staff gave way to smaller teams of specialized professionals. The house that Getty had inhabited remained recognizable in its Tudor bones, but its texture had altered to accommodate different expectations about comfort, convenience, and the relationship between wealth and daily life. The pay telephone, that legendary symbol of Getty's parsimony, had long since been removed. Guests at Sutton Place under later ownership enjoyed communications infrastructure that would have seemed miraculous to Tudor builders and embarrassingly lavish to Getty himself. The anecdote persisted in biographies and documentaries, repeated endlessly as evidence of the psychological peculiarities that attend extreme wealth. But the physical evidence had vanished, just as so much of the Getty architectural legacy had vanished, leaving only stories and photographs where buildings had once stood. Where the Phantom House once stood, an office tower now reflects the sky. On its polished marble floors, no one remembers a dead architect or a vanished swimming pool. In April 1981, in a flat in Rome, John Paul Getty III swallowed a mixture of Valium, methadone, and alcohol. The stroke that followed left him quadriplegic, partially blind, and dependent on care until his death in 2011. The architecture of his remaining 30 years contracted dramatically from the palaces of his childhood and adolescence to the adapted spaces required for profound disability, hospital rooms, rehabilitation centers, and finally the modified living quarters where he spent his last decades navigating a body that could no longer navigate the world. The overdose that caused the stroke was neither entirely accidental nor entirely intentional, according to those who knew him and later tried to make sense of what had happened. Getty III had never recovered from the kidnapping that had taken his ear and, arguably, his future. The 5 months in Calabrian captivity, the mutilation, the knowledge that his grandfather had initially refused to pay for his release, the public spectacle that had made him internationally famous for suffering rather than achievement, all of it had accumulated into a burden that no subsequent life could entirely escape. The substances he consumed on that April evening in Rome represented the endpoint of years of self-medication, an attempt to manage pain that exceeded what ordinary consciousness could tolerate. He had tried other approaches. He had married and had children. He had attempted to build a life in California, away from the European scenes of his trauma. He had sought treatment for the addiction that had developed in the aftermath of the kidnapping, when drugs offered escape from memories that would not fade. But nothing had worked permanently. The pain remained, and the drugs remained the most reliable way of dulling it, and eventually the drugs themselves became the problem, or rather, became another layer of the problem, addiction compounding trauma until the original sources of suffering were buried beneath pharmaceutical complications. The stroke transformed him from a damaged but ambulatory young man into someone who required constant care for every basic function. He could no longer walk, could barely see, could communicate only with difficulty. The beauty that had characterized his youth, he had inherited Talitha Pole's striking features along with the Getty name, was now irrelevant, his body a system requiring medical management rather than a vehicle for experience and pleasure. He was 24 years old, and he would live in this condition for another 30 years. The legal battles that followed consumed years and produced documentation that revealed the family's dysfunction in clinical detail. His mother, Gail Harris, fought for resources to fund his care, arguing that the Getty Trust's billions should provide adequately for a grandson whose injuries were directly attributable to family wealth, who had been targeted by kidnappers precisely because he bore the Getty name, and who had been damaged by his grandfather's refusal to pay prompt ransom. The lawsuits generated depositions, expert testimony, and court decisions that traced the consequences of the kidnapping through subsequent decades, creating a paper trail that historians would later mine for evidence of how the Getty fortune had shaped and damaged those who inherited it. The medical records and legal documents from this period describe the architecture of Getty III's disability in stark functional terms. Square footage of hospital rooms, equipment lists specifying wheelchairs, hospital beds, monitoring devices, staffing requirements for round-the-clock care, accessibility modifications needed for whatever residences he might occupy. The documents made no reference to beauty, to history, to the aesthetic considerations that had governed his grandfather's architectural commissions. They addressed only the practical requirements of maintaining a profoundly disabled life, the ramps, the rails, the adapted bathrooms, the medical equipment that would surround him for the rest of his days. The contrast between these functional spaces and the Getty properties that bore the family name could not have been more stark. While curators at the Getty Villa carefully maintained climate-controlled galleries displaying antiquities worth millions, Getty III occupied rooms designed for medical necessity rather than aesthetic pleasure. While the Getty Center rose on its Brentwood hilltop, its travertine facades announcing cultural ambition to the entire Los Angeles basin, his living spaces were determined by wheelchair-turning radii and bed transfer requirements. The billions that funded the family's cultural philanthropy existed in a different universe than the modest resources allocated for his care. His father, Getty Jr., had by this time emerged from his own period of addiction and withdrawal. The years following Talitha's death and his son's kidnapping had been lost to heroin and isolation, but eventually he had achieved a kind of recovery. Not complete, perhaps, but sufficient to allow re-engagement with the world. The British government had made Getty Jr. a Knight of the Order of the British Empire in recognition of his philanthropic activities, particularly his support for British cultural institutions. He had become Sir Paul Getty, a title that acknowledged his generosity with the fortune he had inherited and that distinguished him from the father whose parsimony remained legendary. Sir Paul established himself at Wormsley Park in Buckinghamshire, purchasing a rundown estate in 1985 and investing in comprehensive restoration over the following decades. The property included historic buildings that he renovated with attention to heritage standards, creating a library with castellated Gothic features to house his growing collection of rare books. He built a cricket ground on the estate, hosting matches for the England team and creating a venue that became famous among cricket enthusiasts as one of the most beautiful in the country. The contrast between father and son, one recovering into philanthropy and English country life, the other descending into disability and institutional care, illustrated how the same family circumstances could produce such different outcomes. Obituaries after Getty III's death in 2011 noted that he never fully recovered from the kidnapping and its consequences, a phrase that captured both the physical facts and the psychological reality of a life defined by a 5-month ordeal experienced at age 16. The buildings he had inhabited since the overdose were functional rather than beautiful, adapted rather than designed, temporary in their arrangements even when he occupied them for years. They represented architecture stripped to its essential purposes: shelter, care, the accommodation of bodily need, without concern for the aesthetic pleasures that characterized other Getty properties. In the end, the heir whose ear paid for his freedom inhabited only a few square meters of adapted space, while thousands of square meters elsewhere bore his name. From the mid-1980s, as Getty Galleries expanded their collections and their public programming, another branch of the family navigated a different kind of architecture: hospitals, clinics, and modest homes. After heiress Aileen Getty learned she was HIV positive in 1984. Her diagnosis came at a moment when the disease was still poorly understood, when stigma attached to sufferers with particular intensity, and when the medical infrastructure for treatment remained primitive compared to what would develop in subsequent decades. The buildings she would inhabit over the following decades reflected these circumstances: treatment centers where experimental protocols were attempted, clinics where support services were offered, and eventually advocacy offices where her experience became the basis for public education. Aileen's HIV diagnosis traced to the early 1980s, a period when the Getty family's difficulties were already well documented in tabloids and serious journalism alike. She had struggled with addiction, as so many of her relatives had struggled. She had navigated the peculiar challenges of being born into extraordinary wealth while possessing an ordinary human need for connection and purpose. The virus she contracted, almost certainly through intravenous drug use, though the specific circumstances remained private, added a medical dimension to challenges that were already complex enough. In 1984, an HIV diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. The treatments that would eventually transform AIDS from fatal illness to manageable chronic condition did not yet exist. Patients diagnosed in the epidemic's early years watched their immune systems fail, their bodies succumb to opportunistic infections, their lives end in hospital rooms where medical staff sometimes refused to enter for fear of contagion. The architecture of AIDS care in that era, was architecture of quarantine, separation, and preparation for death, spaces designed to contain the disease and comfort the dying rather than cure the sick. The architectural response to Aileen's condition evolved as the epidemic itself evolved. Early in her diagnosis, when prognosis remained grim and treatment options limited, she occupied spaces designed primarily for management of decline. Hospital wards with isolation protocols, treatment rooms where experimental drugs were administered in desperate hope, hospice facilities where comfort replaced cure as the organizing principle. The buildings were clinical, institutional, designed according to medical standards that prioritized infection control and efficient care delivery over the human experiences of patients navigating terminal illness. But Aileen survived. Through some combination of luck, timing, and access to the experimental treatments that her family's resources could fund, she outlived the prognosis that her 1984 diagnosis implied. As treatments improved and her own health stabilized, the spaces she inhabited shifted from medical institutions to advocacy organizations. Offices, conference rooms, and public venues replaced hospital wards and treatment facilities. The architecture of dying gave way to the architecture of activism. Her public disclosure of her HIV status, which came in 1992, transformed her relationship to architectural space in ways that earlier generations of Getty women could not have imagined. No longer constrained by secrecy, she could appear at events, speak at conferences, and occupy platforms that her condition had previously foreclosed. The buildings associated with AIDS activism, community centers where support groups met, research facilities where scientists worked toward treatments and vaccines, government offices where policy was debated and funding allocated, became her professional environment. She moved through these spaces as an advocate rather than a patient, using her family name and personal experience to attract attention and resources to a cause that remained stigmatized despite growing medical understanding. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, her uncle Sir Paul Getty was transforming Wormsley Park into a different kind of family space, one designed for hospitality, cultural engagement, and the perpetuation of English country house traditions that earlier Getty residences had never quite achieved. Sutton Place had been a fortress of isolation, its Tudor magnificence serving as backdrop for a recluse's carefully controlled existence. The bohemian residences of Getty Jr.'s youth had been stages for self-destruction, beautiful settings for lives that burned too brightly and too fast. But Wormsley was designed from the beginning as a place for others to enjoy. The cricket ground that Sir Paul built at Wormsley represented a particular vision of English tradition adapted for American wealth. Cricket had been central to English country house life for centuries, the sport's leisurely pace and complex rituals perfectly suited to weekend gatherings where hospitality extended across entire days. By building a ground capable of hosting international matches, Sir Paul was inserting himself into a tradition that his father had never understood or valued. The tradition of generous hospitality, of spaces designed to welcome others rather than keep them at controlled distances. The contrast between Aileen's advocacy spaces and Sir Paul's English estate illustrated how differently family members had responded to the Getty inheritance. She had converted personal suffering into public purpose, using modest offices and community venues as bases for education and activism that potentially benefited millions of people facing the same disease. He had converted personal suffering, the addiction, the death of Talitha, the kidnapping and disability of his son, into traditional philanthropy, expressed through restored buildings and cultural programming. Both responses represented attempts to find meaning in circumstances that might otherwise have seemed merely destructive. For the first time in Getty architectural history, a family space, Wormsley, became less a fortress than a place where others were invited in. By the late 1990s, visitors riding the tram up to the Getty Center entered a world carefully engineered against disaster. By 2017 and again in 2025, wildfires would test those claims with increasing intensity. The Brentwood hilltop that Richard Meyer had transformed into a travertine campus sat in a landscape that burned regularly, its chaparral vegetation adapted to fire cycles that no amount of architectural planning could entirely eliminate. The tension between the center's permanence and its environment's volatility became increasingly apparent as Southern California's fire seasons grew more intense, more prolonged, and more destructive. The center's fire protection systems represented some of the most sophisticated defenses ever installed in a cultural institution. Engineers had studied the region's fire history, consulted with experts on wildfire behavior, and designed systems that anticipated threats from multiple directions. The million-gallon water tank could supply firefighting operations for extended periods, even if municipal water systems failed. Fire-resistant plantings replaced native chaparral on the hillsides, immediately surrounding the buildings, creating defensive zones where flames would find reduced fuel. The travertine and concrete construction eliminated combustible materials from the structures themselves, ensuring that even if fire reached the building's exteriors, it would find nothing to sustain continued burning. The interior fire doors could seal galleries from one another, preventing smoke from spreading through the climate-controlled spaces where collections were displayed. Air filtration systems, designed primarily to maintain archival conditions for delicate objects, could also filter smoke particles that might penetrate the building envelope during nearby fires. The helipad allowed emergency access when roads became impassable, ensuring that staff and emergency responders could reach the hilltop even when surrounding areas were evacuated. Staff trained regularly on emergency protocols, running drills that prepared them for scenarios that insurance actuaries considered unlikely but possible. The 2017 Skirball fire tested these preparations with the closest approach to the Getty Center since its opening. Flames swept through the Sepulveda Pass, driven by Santa Ana winds that sent ember showers across distances that firefighters could not easily defend. The fire approached the center from the northwest, climbing hillsides that defensive plantings and brush clearance had not entirely protected. Staff implemented emergency protocols, securing galleries and activating protection systems. Firefighters established defensive positions on the museum grounds, using the center's water resources and fire breaks to hold the perimeter against flames that burned within sight of the travertine pavilions. When the fire passed, the buildings remained undamaged. Collections that represented centuries of artistic achievement were secure. The engineering that Getty Resources had funded, the water tanks, the fire-resistant materials, the defensive landscaping, had proven adequate to the challenge. Getty officials spoke of the center as the safest place for art during a fire, a phrase that combined justified pride in institutional preparation with acknowledgement that Southern California's fire risks were permanent features of the landscape. But the 2017 fire also revealed vulnerabilities that planning had not fully addressed. Landscaping on the hillside suffered significant damage, requiring years of restoration work. The approaches to the center remained closed for extended periods as surrounding roads were cleared of debris, utility lines repaired, and damaged infrastructure replaced. The experience of watching flames approach a billion-dollar cultural campus while nearby neighborhoods burned and residents evacuated with whatever possessions they could carry, raised questions about the center's relationship to its surrounding community that would intensify with subsequent fires. The Palisades fire of January 2025 exceeded anything the region had experienced in living memory. The fire swept through Pacific Palisades with an intensity that overwhelmed initial suppression efforts, destroying thousands of structures and forcing evacuations across a vast area of western Los Angeles. Historic neighborhoods that had stood since the early 20th century were reduced to foundations and ash. The infrastructure that supported millions of residents, power lines, water mains, roads, and communication systems suffered damage that would require months to repair. The Getty Villa, situated directly in the fire's path along the Pacific Coast Highway, experienced its most severe test since opening. Flames reached the property's perimeter, burning through vegetation that landscape architects had planted to evoke Mediterranean settings. Roughly 1,400 trees burned, their loss transforming views that visitors had enjoyed for decades. A perimeter wall collapsed under the fire's intensity. Irrigation systems that maintained the Roman-inspired gardens melted, their pipes requiring complete replacement before plantings could be restored. Yet the collections and galleries remained secure. The double walls that architects had specified decades earlier held back heat and smoke. The fire doors that could seal galleries from the exterior environment functioned exactly as designed. The climate control systems maintained stable conditions inside, even as temperatures outside soared to levels that would have destroyed unprotected organic materials. The Roman fantasy that Getty had commissioned survived the fire that destroyed the landscape surrounding it, a fortress of culture amid devastation, its contents preserved, while the natural setting that framed them was transformed. The contrast between the protected campus and the devastated neighborhoods below sharpened existing tensions about the Getty institution's relationship to the communities they served. Here was a cultural complex designed to withstand disasters that destroyed homes, businesses, and the accumulated possessions of families who had spent lifetimes building lives in Pacific Palisades. Here was concentrated wealth protecting concentrated culture, while ordinary residents fled with whatever they could carry in their cars. Getty officials responded to these perceptions by emphasizing the institution's community role during and after the fires. The center and villa offered resources for disaster response. Staff participated in recovery efforts. Programming addressed the trauma that communities were processing. Officials spoke of the Getty properties as refugees for a wounded region, places where people could find beauty, stability, and continuity amid chaos. Inside the rotunda, Van Gogh's Irises hangs untouched. Outside, real hillsides burn a different shade of blue. On January 7, 2025, as the Palisades fire reached the grounds of the Getty Villa, trees burned and a perimeter wall collapsed. 3,000 miles away, the lawns of Sutton Place lay quiet under English winter skies. The two flagship Getty estates, one actively threatened by natural disaster, the other long since removed from family control, illustrated how differently the architectural legacy had evolved on opposite sides of the Atlantic. The buildings that had once embodied a single man's vision of permanence now served purposes that Getty himself could not have anticipated and would not have approved. The villa's ordeal during the January fires exceeded anything it had previously experienced. The fire approached from multiple directions simultaneously, driven by winds that shifted unpredictably throughout the night and early morning hours. Flames consumed the mature trees that had given the property its Mediterranean character, the eucalyptus that had cast shade on the peristyle garden, the oaks that had framed views toward the Pacific, the ornamental species that landscape architects had planted to evoke the vegetation of Herculaneum before Vesuvius destroyed it. The loss transformed the visual experience of the property in ways that would require decades to repair, if full repair proved possible at all. The irrigation systems that had maintained the Roman-inspired gardens melted under temperatures that exceeded any scenario their designers had anticipated. Pipes that had carried water to herb, gardens planted with varieties documented in ancient agricultural treatises, to flower beds arranged in patterns copied from Roman mosaics, to the formal hedges that defined outdoor rooms in the classical manner. All of this infrastructure failed, leaving the gardens without the constant moisture that Southern California's climate demanded. The plantings themselves suffered accordingly, their survival dependent on emergency measures that staff implemented while the fire still threatened surrounding areas. The perimeter wall that had separated the cultural enclave from the Pacific Coast Highway collapsed in sections, its materials unable to withstand the combination of direct flame exposure and radiant heat that the fire delivered. The wall had been designed primarily for security and visual screening rather than fire resistance, and it proved inadequate to the unprecedented challenge. Its failure exposed the villa's grounds to views from the highway that Getty's planners had worked to exclude, connecting the Roman fantasy to the contemporary reality of emergency vehicles, news crews, and the infrastructure of disaster response. Yet the core of the institution held. The galleries where antiquities worth hundreds of millions of dollars were displayed remained sealed behind fire doors that functioned exactly as their specifications required. The climate systems that maintained stable temperature and humidity for objects dating back millennia continued their quiet operation, even as temperatures outside soared and smoke filled the air. The bronze athletes and marble gods that Getty had assembled to evoke Roman domestic luxury remained in their places, indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding beyond the walls that protected them. Staff who remained on site to implement emergency protocols worked in conditions that tested both their training and their physical endurance. They wore protective equipment, monitored fire locations, coordinated with emergency responders, and made decisions about when to evacuate and when to shelter in place. The experience transformed their relationship to an institution that most had experienced as a place of quiet contemplation and scholarly activity. The villa revealed itself as a fortress, beautiful on its surface but defended at its core against threats that most visitors never considered. The Roman dream that Getty had commissioned to house his antiquities survived the fire that destroyed the landscape surrounding it. The objects that he had collected across decades, that he had arranged in settings designed to evoke their original contexts, that he had intended to preserve for future generations, all of this remained secure while 1,400 trees burned and the California that Getty had known transformed into something that would have seemed apocalyptic to those who remembered the state's earlier decades. Meanwhile, at Sutton Place, the January day passed without incident. The Tudor estate that had once served as Getty's principal residence, that had witnessed the kidnapping negotiations and hosted the pay telephone legend, continued under its current ownership with no visible connection to events unfolding in California. The Great Hall still rose to its hammer-beam ceiling, its medieval craftsmanship undiminished by the centuries that had passed since Tudor builders raised it. The long library still stretched along the garden front, its shelves holding books that subsequent owners had acquired according to their own interests rather than Getty's. The grounds, though reconfigured by decades of subdivision and development, retained their English tranquility. Winter rains had greened the lawns that spread from the house toward boundaries that no longer corresponded to Getty's original purchases. The deer that had grazed in the park during Getty's residency had been managed according to current estate practices. The specimen trees that survived, those that had not been lost to storms or disease or development, stood as they had stood for centuries, indifferent to the changes in ownership that had occurred beneath their canopy. The contrast between the two properties illuminated how thoroughly the Getty name had been transferred from personal association to institutional identity. Sutton Place carried Getty history but bore no Getty involvement. The current owners, representatives of a different fortune, a different era, a different relationship to English property, maintained the building according to their own requirements and aesthetic preferences. The anecdotes that attached to Getty's years there survived as elements of the property's heritage documentation, of interest to historians and tourists, but exerting no influence on daily operations. The villa, by contrast, remained intensely Getty, its every gallery and garden bed designed to realize Getty's vision, funded by Getty resources, maintained by staff who understood themselves as custodians of his legacy. The fire that threatened it threatened not just objects, but a comprehensive cultural enterprise built on one man's fortune and one family's name. The institution's survival represented victory not just over natural forces, but over time's tendency to erode individual legacies into collective memory and eventual forgetting. Television coverage of the villa's ordeal frequently referenced the Getty curse, the convenient label that journalists had attached to the family's misfortunes across generations. The kidnapping of Getty III, the death of Talitha, the overdoses and disabilities and estrangements that had accumulated across decades, all of it organized under a rubric that suggested supernatural causation rather than the more prosaic combination of extreme wealth, family dysfunction, and the ordinary workings of chance that characterized many family histories. The fire added another chapter to this narrative, flames seemingly pursuing even the institutional expressions of Getty ambition. Yet, the villa's survival also challenged the curse narrative. Here was a Getty creation that endured, that resisted the forces of destruction, that protected what it was designed to protect. The engineering that Getty Resources had funded, the defensive architecture that his advisors had specified, the institutional protocols that his trustees had developed, All of it proved adequate to the challenge that the Palisades fire presented. If there was a Getty curse, the villa's fire-resistant construction suggested it might be overcome through sufficient investment and planning. The houses survived. The family that built their legend did not live long enough to control what they now mean. In the 2020s, a visitor can stand in the central garden of the Getty Center, the peristyle of the Getty Villa, or on a public road looking through trees toward Sutton Place and see only serenity. The architectural surfaces present beauty, order, and the appearance of permanence that Getty sought across his lifetime of collecting and building. What they do not reveal, what architectural surfaces cannot reveal, is the human complexity that funded their creation, the family fractures that attended their construction, the compromises and cruelties and failures that the stones absorbed without visible record. The Getty Center welcomes hundreds of thousands of visitors annually, offering them travertine terraces and carefully curated collections and commanding views across the Los Angeles basin from mountains to ocean. The tram that carries visitors up the hillside deposits them in a space designed to inspire awe, to suggest that culture can rise above the city's complications into something pure and permanent and worthy of the pilgrimage that access requires. The experience is genuine, the architecture is beautiful, the collection significant, the programming thoughtful and professionally executed, but it is also incomplete, edited to exclude the family difficulties that provided its resources and that give the Getty name its complicated resonance. Visitors walking through the pavilions that display European paintings, Asian art, medieval manuscripts, and photography encounter objects that have been separated from the circumstances of their acquisition. They see masterpieces by Rembrandt and Titian and Van Gogh, without reference to the oil wells that funded their purchase, the business strategies that multiplied the family's wealth, or the personal coldness that characterized Getty's relationships with nearly everyone who sought his attention. The museum experience depends on this separation, on the ability to appreciate beauty without being burdened by the context that made acquisition possible. The Getty Villa offers a different version of the same edited experience. Visitors walk through peristyle gardens that have been restored since the January fires, pausing before bronze athletes and marble gods that Getty assembled to evoke classical antiquity. The fire damage that transformed surrounding landscapes remains visible in certain views, hillsides where mature trees once stood, now showing the early stages of regeneration. But the galleries themselves preserve their intended serenity. The Roman fantasy persists, offering visitors an imaginative transportation to ancient times that requires no engagement with the contemporary complications of the family whose name appears above the entrance. At Sutton Place, the Tudor magnificence persists under ownership that has no connection to the Getty family beyond the historical accident that Getty once lived there. Visitors who arrange access through current management, the property is not generally open to the public, find a house that retains its architectural character while serving purposes that Getty could not have anticipated. The Great Hall still impresses, the long library still stretches toward gardens that retain vestiges of their Tudor character, despite decades of modification. But the Getty associations are historical rather than living, matters of documentation rather than daily experience. Later generations of Gettys navigate their inheritance in various ways that illustrate no single pattern. Some embrace the visibility that the name provides, appearing in society coverage and fashion photography that presents wealth as glamour rather than complication. Others build business careers that extend the family's economic influence while avoiding the psychological complications that attended earlier generations. Still, others continue the advocacy and philanthropic work that became possible as the family emerged from its most troubled period. The pattern suggests neither curse nor blessing, merely the ordinary variation of human response to extraordinary circumstances. Journalists still invoke the Getty curse when family difficulties arise, finding in the phrase a convenient shorthand for stories that might otherwise require more nuanced explanation. An overdose, an estrangement, a legal dispute, a tragic accident. Each event can be framed as evidence of supernatural forces pursuing the family across generations, punishing them for the original sin of excessive wealth or the specific sins that wealth enabled. The narrative provides satisfying drama, suggesting that vast fortunes carry hidden costs that no amount of money can pay. But historians and biographers who examine the evidence more carefully see a pattern that requires no supernatural explanation. Extreme wealth creates extreme complications. Children who inherit fortunes they did not earn face challenges that most people never encounter. Challenges of identity, of purpose, of relationships with others who may be more interested in access to resources than in genuine connection. The dysfunction that characterized the Getty family across generations resembles the dysfunction that has characterized other enormously wealthy families, from the Vanderbilts to the Rockefellers to the various merchant and industrial dynasties that accumulated fortunes during previous eras of capitalist expansion. What distinguished the Gettys was not the presence of tragedy, which afflicts families at every economic level, but the public attention that their tragedy attracted. The kidnapping of Getty III would have been a private family horror if the grandfather had not been the richest man in America. The death of Talitha would have been mourned by friends and family without becoming a symbol of an era's excesses if she had not been married to an heir whose name guaranteed newspaper coverage. The overdoses, the disabilities, the estrangements, all of these might have occurred in any family. But in the Getty family, they occurred under the scrutiny of an international press that found in their misfortunes confirmation of familiar narratives about the corrupting effects of wealth. The architectural legacy tells a partial version of this story. The buildings that survive, the institutional properties primarily, represent what Getty wanted to preserve. Collections displayed in settings that would inspire visitors and educate future generations, his name attached to enterprises that would outlast his bloodline and its complications. The buildings that disappeared, the Phantom House, the Bohemian residences, the adapted spaces of disability and recovery, represent what proved less durable: personal attachments, human needs, the ordinary business of living rather than collecting. The surviving architecture is magnificent but selective, preserving the parts of the Getty story that fit the narrative of cultural philanthropy while allowing everything else to vanish into private memory or documentary footnote. What remains of the so-called curse is simpler and more human than supernatural framing suggests. Enormous wealth creates enormous complications that wealth alone cannot resolve. Children of extraordinary privilege face challenges that no amount of money can address. Buildings can be engineered against fire and earthquake and theft, but they cannot be engineered against the emotional forces that burn through families across generations. Stone preserves itself better than relationships preserve themselves. These observations require no curse to explain them, merely attention to patterns that recur wherever concentrated wealth passes from generation to generation without adequate preparation for the psychological burdens that inheritance carries. The visitor walking through Getty galleries today encounters beauty, scholarship, and the accumulated evidence of one man's determination to build something permanent. The travertine terraces of the center, the Roman colonnades of the villa, the Tudor Great Hall of Sutton Place, all testify to resources applied at a scale that few individuals can command. But the visitor does not encounter the family that made these buildings possible, does not see the son mutilated in a mountain hut, the grandson struggling with disability in adapted spaces, the daughters and nieces and nephews navigating the complicated inheritance of a name that carries as much burden as benefit. This absence is not accidental. Getty's vision always prioritized objects over people, collections over relationships, institutional permanence over family continuity. The buildings he commissioned reflect this priority with perfect accuracy, designed to serve art rather than life, to preserve the past rather than nurture the present, to outlast the generations that built them, while offering no particular help to those generations as they struggled with the ordinary difficulties of human existence. Their survival vindicates his choices in one sense: the collections remain, the galleries function, the cultural enterprise continues. But their survival also confirms what those choices cost: a family whose difficulties became public legend while its patriarch built private monuments. In the end, the Getty palaces kept their walls and their water, but not their certainty. The fire doors hold against flames that approach from chaparral hillsides. The climate systems maintain conditions that protect objects created millennia ago. The conservation protocols preserve materials that have survived eruptions and invasions and the slow erosion of centuries. But certainty about what it all means, whether the buildings represent cultural achievement or cautionary tale, whether the collections justify the complications that funded them, whether beauty can be separated from the suffering that made its accumulation possible, remains as elusive as it was when Getty signed the papers for his first California mansion and began the process of building a legacy that would outlast everything except questions. The afternoon light falls on a single balustrade, a recurring element across Getty properties: the villa's peristyle, the center's terraces, the remnant spaces of Sutton Place that preserve Tudor craftsmanship for visitors who know nothing of the American industrialist who briefly owned them. The stone is cool beneath fingertips, worn by decades of hands that touched it without thinking about the hands that came before or would come after. The gardens spread beyond the railing, maintained by staff who know the planting schedules and the irrigation requirements and the pest management protocols, but not necessarily the family histories that make the properties meaningful beyond their horticultural achievements. Somewhere in the distance, a city continues its business, indifferent to the dramas that unfolded in these elegant rooms. The traffic flows on freeways that were not built when Getty began his collection. The neighborhoods spread across hillsides that will burn again, in fires whose timing and intensity no one can predict. The institutions that bear his name continue their missions, acquiring, preserving, displaying, educating, while the family whose wealth enabled those missions continues its own trajectory through time, producing children who will inherit the name and the complications that attend it. The camera observes without judgment, framing the marble and travertine and Tudor brick in light that changes with the hours and the seasons. The water moves through channels that Roman engineers would have recognized, carrying no memory of the purposes that motivated its installation. The bronze figures cast shadows that shift with the sun, their poses unchanged since craftsmen created them to satisfy patrons whose names have been forgotten while the objects survive. And the silence that follows the final word is not the silence of conclusion, but of continuation, the ongoing process by which buildings become history, by which families become stories, by which the elaborate structures we build to house our ambitions outlast the ambitions themselves, while revealing nothing certain about whether they were worth the cost. The Getty palaces remain. The family that built their legend remains in some form diminished, but continuing. What remains uncertain, and will always remain uncertain, is whether the stone preserves anything essential or merely provides beautiful surfaces for questions that no architecture, however magnificent, can finally answer. In the end, the Getty palaces kept their walls and their water, but not their certainty. What survives of the so-called curse is simpler and more human, the knowledge that no amount of stone can guarantee how a story will be remembered.